It's time for the Phil Ferguson Show.
Buongiorno tutti. Hello, everybody. This is Phil Ferguson, and you are listening to the cleverly titled Phil Ferguson Show. This is show number 193. And for anyone who happens to be new to the show is about pretty much anything I want, but usually it's about 1/3 finance, 2/3 atheism. But from time to time, we do something completely different, and this is going to be one of those episodes. The interview later in the show is with Raymond or Ray Smock. He is a pretty well-known historian, and he is currently the director of the Robert C. Byrd Center for Legislative Studies at Shepherd University, and he is a former historian for the United States House of Representatives, serving in that capacity from 1983 to 1995. So he knows a lot of things about history, and we are going to have a really fun talk about history and the mistakes of history and the Congress and the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. And I think you're going to really, really enjoy it. So hopefully you do. Before we get to that, of course, we'll have our segment on investing skeptically. And it's kind of a struggle for me each week to figure out what to talk about, because I can get real specific into a technical part of the investing world, or I can get real generic. And today is one of those ones that I might get a little more generic. We're going to talk about stocks and kind of what a stock is and how it works and the returns you can expect from the market. And I've got my little air quotes up because we're in a podcast, so you can't tell. But this is driven by the fact that in the last couple of weeks, I have received several emails of people asking me my opinion of a specific stock or two. You are wasting your time asking me such a question. I have no fucking clue whether the specific stock you are asking about is likely to go up or down. It's not what I do. I don't pretend to have any knowledge in it. And matter of fact, I think the vast majority of people that claim to have knowledge in it are wrong. I mean, at least 50% of the time. I found a cute couple of quotes here. Here's one from Warren Buffett. "We have long felt that the only value of stock forecasters is to make fortune tellers look good." So that's Warren Buffett's opinion on stock market investors, or at least those who forecast what stocks are going to do. And one of the things that I like to say is the best way to make money in the long run is to invest for the long run. So I don't jump around. I don't get in and out of stocks. And sometimes by jumping in and out of stocks, especially if you're in a taxable account, you can create odd situations where when the market goes down, you still might actually owe taxes at the end of the year. It's a weird thing that can happen sometimes, and if it happens to you, you will find it very annoying that you get to the end of the year, your portfolio is down small to a considerable amount of money, but you still owe taxes because during the year, you sold some things that made money, but in the total, in the aggregate, you lost money, but you still owe the tax. And of course, if you don't have cash sitting there to pay the tax, you now have to sell something to pay your taxes. And you can be certain that is not going to help your performance if you're forced to sell something. And of course, one of the problems with buying and selling individual stocks is that you end up using a lot of emotion. And if you don't, there's methodologies called tactical investment, and we've already had shows on that in the past, and we'll talk about it again. That doesn't work either. It is really, really, really difficult to beat the stock market. And when I ask people to name someone that has beaten the stock market over long periods of time, they usually mention Warren Buffett. Now, I don't actually know if he has or hasn't beaten the market over a long period of time. Let's pretend that he has, because I'm guessing without checking that he has. Yet he doesn't count. He's not a stock picker. He's not buying a stock and holding it to wait to see if the company does better. He takes over companies. He buys large portions of companies, and he and his team go in and fix those companies. So it's a different skill set, and it's a very valuable skill set, and he's made a lot of money. And if you've bought Berkshire Hathaway stock a long time ago, you made an awful lot of money also. And of course, people will ask me, since I'm talking about Berkshire Hathaway, well, should I just buy stock in Berkshire Hathaway? That's fine if you want to. It's very expensive stock. Not that that matters. But Warren Buffett is also a very old man. And when he is not doing this, will the market returns continue like they have in the past? And not everything he does makes a lot of money. Matter of fact, the reason his company is called Berkshire Hathaway is he bought a company called Berkshire Hathaway that made men's suits in the United States of America, and it almost went broke. He lost a lot of money, and he decided to keep the name because it would constantly remind him that you can make mistakes. And another one of Warren Buffett's quotes, you only have to do a very few things right in your life so long as you don't do too many wrong things. And so it's a reminder to him that he is not above mistakes. And one of the things I see a lot of times when people talk to me that are stock pickers is they suffer from, I don't know what we call this, a syndrome, a situation, a reality, that they have what is called illusory superiority. Not necessarily in everything, although most humans, and I include myself, we tend to think that we're better than average. And when it comes to investing, individual investors, people who buy and sell stocks, tend to think that they're better than average. They think that they can go and pick the right stocks when no one else knows what the right stocks are. It is incredibly difficult to do. Another thing that I think of, think about all the people you know. Did you ever know anyone that was always trying to strike it rich? Did you notice they're always trying? If you have to keep trying to strike it rich, it's because it doesn't work. If striking it rich worked, you could then stop because you would be rich. It's one of those things that doesn't work. And often people talk about, well, what is the data for something like this? Well, I don't necessarily have data for striking it rich philosophy, but I do have a fun bit of data from a website called OpenFolio. And I've talked about it in the past, and it's also a great thing to talk about after the end of the year, so I may bring it up again in January. But I happened to go look at it because I was talking with somebody on Facebook, and they said, do you actually have any data that shows that investing by individuals doesn't work very well? And I have said many times on the show that the average investor underperforms the stock market about 4% per year on average. And I had someone call me out on that and say, you've got to be kidding me. There's no way. And so one of the things I generally report on the show is that if the U.S. stock market in an average year makes 10%, and there's no such thing as an actual average year, but on average, it's about 10%. The average mutual fund makes about 8%, or more about 7.8, but we're going to round it for fun, about 8%. But the average investor makes about 6%. And if you're in a taxable account, it's actually worse than that because of what we talked about. You have taxes and trading costs and expenses. And a lot of those things, people often don't, when they calculate their performance, they don't subtract the taxes out of their performance. They just pay the taxes out of their income, and they forget about it. But you need to track that if you're going to do some kind of fair comparison. So OpenFolio is a website, and you can go Google OpenFolio, and you want to look at what they call their insights, which is basically their blog. And every month they do an analysis to say how have their average members done versus the market. And they do this for every month. And so what I did was I took all 11 months, January through November of calendar year 2016, and looked at them one by one and then calculated what those returns would compound to at the end of the year. And right now we have the S&P 500 is up about 9%, give or take. And the average investor in OpenFolio, and again, this is $80,000 1,000 people that have signed up voluntarily, so there might be some kind of weird selection bias, but I would assume if you thought you sucked at picking stocks, you wouldn't join this thing to track all your trades and show off to your friends. You want to see how others are doing, and you want others to see how you're doing. The average on OpenFolio is about 3%. So in the first 11 months, or 11 out of 12 months of 2016, the average investor on OpenFolio has made 3, but the stock market, as measured by the S&P 500, has made 9. So an underperformance of 6%. It wasn't that bad last year, and I don't know why it's worse this year, but it fluctuates, and you might have a year where they underperform only 1 or 2%. You might even have a year where the average investor outperforms the S&P 500. It happens. You can find those time periods. Just like if you look at the long-term trend of global warming, you can probably find a 5-year period where there was cooling. But the bigger trend, the overall picture, is that average investors significantly, and I'm going to stick with 4% now until I find a better number, underperform the market. In the last 11 months, it's been underperforming by about 6%. So that's one of the reasons of many that I tell people not to do stock trading, because you bring in a lot of other variables. You bring in a lot of other risks. You have to know when to buy. You have to know what to buy. You have to know when to sell. You have tax consequences. You have trading costs. You have research. I've lost track of the number of people that have told me they've made a fortune in day trading until they lost all their money. Well, then it doesn't count. I mean, if you bet on horses and you win 3 times in a row, and then the 4th time you lose all your money, you're not a winner at horse betting. You lost all of your money. And you can claim you have a 75% success rate, which is statistically better than 50-50, but you still lost all your money. The end results are the same. Are there exceptions? Of course there are. Are you going to be one of those exceptions? Of course you're not. I mean, maybe someone listening to the show has done it for a long period of time, and maybe I'll get some hate mail about this, but for the average listener, the odds are, the data says, you are not going to succeed at a stock picker. That's part of the reason so many people use mutual funds. They do better than you do, and you don't have to do the work. The way to do better than just average mutual funds, of course, is index funds. And one of the beautiful things about index funds is you virtually eliminate all specific stock risk. So if you own every single stock in the United States stock market, and one of them is Enron, and it goes to $0 in value, you won't really notice. On the other hand, if one of those stocks goes up 10 times in value, you probably also won't really notice it. And it takes some of the fun or the excitement out of investing, where people like the excitement of picking stocks and getting in and out. And that's fine if that's what you want to do. The reason I invest is to make the most money in the long run. So if you want to make the most money in the long run, invest for the long run. Don't hop in and out. Don't play around. I tell people often, my advice is kind of like the tortoise in the fable of the tortoise and the hare, the turtle and the rabbit, the turtle and the hare, whatever you want to call it. It's really boring investment advice. Buy and hold. The single most important thing in how to money is the first step, and that is to spend less than you make. It's so easy to say. It's so hard to do. And I myself have spent my entire life struggling to follow my own fucking advice. It's easy for me to say, save 20%. It's much harder to do because, quite honestly, spending 3 weeks in Italy is pretty fucking cool. But, you've got to try to strike this balance, but you need to save money. That is how you get to retirement. Now I want to talk about the long-term results of the stock market. So assuming you've moved past individual stock ownership, assuming you've moved past average mutual funds, which slightly underperform the market, assuming that you're in a IRA or a Roth IRA, so you don't have to pay taxes and any consequences. You're not buying software. You're just investing. And in this case, we're just going to invest in the S&P 500. And the reason I'm going to do that is because it's very, very easy for you to go check the data. I do not want you to rely on me telling you what is true and what is a fact. So part of science-based investing is that you can go check some of these sources too. Now, my favorite book of all is called Common Sense on Mutual Funds, written by John Bogle, the founder of Vanguard. And sadly, no, Vanguard doesn't pay me anything to keep telling you how awesome they are. It's the funds that I invest are in our Vanguard index funds. And that's the same thing that my clients' money goes into. So I actually put my money where I put their money. So good or bad, at least I'm doing the same thing for myself. But that book will cover 200 years of data, but it's harder for you to get to. I mean, you have to buy the book or go to the library and look at it, which I do recommend if you really want to know how investing works. But the reason I use the S&P 500 is because there's a really nice Wikipedia page, and the S&P 500 returns by year are all listed there, at least from, I think, 1970 to today. So it's about 45, 46 years of data. So you can look at that. It does go back a few years before that, and there are places you can go look. But to get really good data, like from the Dow Jones Industrial Average, you actually have to pay a fee to the Dow Jones Corporation because that's why they collect the data to sell it to you. That's what they do. It's like Nielsen ratings for TV shows. They pay for that data. So the S&P 500 is listed in that Wikipedia page, so you can go look at it. Wikipedia, S&P 500. And what I want to do is talk about investing in the S&P 500 for a period of 10 years. And what you're going to do is you're going to start with an investment of $100,000. And you're going to invest for 10 years. And one of my favorite things to ask people when I talk to them on the phone, if they call and they might be a prospective client, is how much do you think you could lose? If you invest $100,000 for 10 years and you happen to buy at the worst time period, and we're looking at 1970 up until today, the worst 10-year time period, how much money do you think you would have at the end of the 10 years? And I'll give you a hint. It's less. You'll have at the end less than $100,000. So you start with $100,000. 10 years later, how much do you think you have? Think of an answer in your head before I give you the answer, but just think about that. You invest for 10 years. The answer is you'd have about $87,000. And is that awful? Yeah, that's awful. Who wants to invest for an entire decade and know that 10 years later they have less money? It's disheartening and it can be very sad. And this is the reason why when you get close to retirement, you should not have all of your money in one type of investment, i.e. the S&P 500, what I'm talking about specifically. You should build what I call the cushion. You should have some money somewhere that doesn't have the opportunity to make as much, but it won't go down just in case the market goes down. You have something that didn't go down, and you can still take money out and pay your bills. Now, the interesting thing is that if you look over the entire time frame from 1970 until today, there is only 2 time periods where when you invest for 10 years, you lost money. When you invest for 15 years, the worst that you've ever done is an average return of 4.2% per year. So you still made pretty good money. Now, it turns out that the worst 10-year period included the dot-com crash, and that was in 99, 2000, 2001, and even 2002. And it also included the housing bubble burst in 2008. So it included 2 really big market drops. And even with all the fear and the hysteria of those 2 really big historical bear markets, you only lost 13%. Now, like I said, that's only 2 10-year rolling time periods out of the 37 that are available, 40 that are available. So it's a very small probability just looking at the statistics. Then the next question I ask people is, what is the best 10-year time period? So you are a really, really lucky individual. You happen to invest at the right time. You put in $100,000. 10 years later, how much money do you think you're going to have? And I'll give you a hint. It's more than $150,000. So think about that for a minute. Put a number in your head before I give you the answer. You invest $100,000 for 10 years in the S&P 500. 10 years later, what is the absolute best return that you could have gotten over the last 40-something years? And the answer is $580,000. It's a staggering large amount of money. And that's from 89 until the end of 1998. So at the last 5 years there, you had the dot-com bubble, but 89, the market went up 31, almost 32%. In 91, it went up 30%. And then in the late 90s, it was 38, 23, 34, 29, 21% year after year after year. The market normally can't do that. And that's probably why we had the big drop in 2000, 2001, 2002. But during that 10-year time period, and I'm picking very carefully specific 10-year time period, your money went from $100,000 to $580,000. Now, the good skeptics, and people do this all the time when I walk them through this thought experiment, they say, Phil, that $580,000 return is an anomaly. I can't expect that to happen. That only happened once, one 10-year rolling time period over the last 46 years. And I said, you're right. But the 13% loss also only happened once. But you didn't point that out when it was a loss. We place more fear on the loss than we do on the potential gain. So the odds of your money going from $100,000 to $87,000, based on historical data, because I do not know the future, the odds of going from $100,000 to $87,000 are the same as the odds of going from $100,000 to $580,000. It happened once. Now, what is likely to happen? What is likely to happen is that if you invest for a 10-year time period, you're going to make about 10%. If you invest for a 20-year time period, it's about 10%. If you invest for a 25-year time period, it's about 10%. And if you understand standard deviations, when you invest for a 25-year time period, again, this is now based on 200 years of data, and this is pulled from John Bogle's book, Common Sense on Mutual Funds. The data, historical data, shows an average return of 10%, plus or minus 1.4%, one standard deviation. So that means if you invest for 25 years, there's a 66% chance that you're going to make 10% with 1.4 added or subtracted. So between 8.6 and 11.4. That's 2/3 of the time you're going to have numbers in there. That's pretty freaking good. Now, if you go out to 3 standard deviations, and if I have remembered this right, that's 99% probability. So 99% of the time, you are going to make 10% plus or minus 1.4 times 3. And, of course, that's 4.2. So 99% of the time, you're going to make 10 plus or minus 4.2. So you're going to be somewhere between 5.8 and 14.2%, 99% of the time. So even on the low side, you do the absolute worst 25-year time performance in all of the 200 years of history, you're still going to make almost 6%. And that's the worst. And so if you are 20 or 30 or even 40, anyone that's 10, 15 or more years from retirement, in my opinion, and that's the only thing I have, you should be investing in stocks. Now, you can do domestic and international, and there's all kinds of things we can talk about, and we will on other shows. But stocks are where you make money, especially when you're in a time period of extremely low bond returns. So that's some thoughts about stocks and stock markets and index funds and long-term returns. If you are a long-term investor, you can dramatically reduce the volatility in the long run, not in the short run. It's still going to go up and down. You just have to breathe through it and relax and not worry about it. Be a long-term investor. So hope you enjoyed that. We're going to do a few things here in a little break, and then we're going to come back and talk to Ray Smock.
Here's an excerpt from Our Constitution, The Way It Was by Dr. Madeleine O'Hare.
Seemingly, no one knew just what to do. There was no clear-cut program. Some wanted to try to continue to negotiate with the British government. Others wanted to continue the armed revolt in the hopes of forcing the king and Parliament to remedy their grievances. There was no one, apparently, who had the vision to call for complete severance of all political ties with Britain and to found a new nation. The situation remained stalemated until the end of the year. Then, in January 1775, Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, came off the press. It was like a fresh wind clearing away a fog. In the simple yet forceful language that characterizes all his writings, Paine showed the absurdity of continuing a relationship of colonies to a mother country. Why, he asked, should the colonies, already peopled with 3 million inhabitants and destined to expand to cover a vast continent, be ruled from a small island 3,000 miles away? Why continue to be subjects of a tyrant king when the way was open to be citizens of a free republic? This pamphlet spread like wildfire. The small presses of the time could not keep up with the demand. Hundreds of thousands of copies were issued and penetrated to every colony in a short time. Paine's arguments were unanswerable. They left no middle ground. All talk of compromise and further petitions to Parliament died out. The debate was carried into the Continental Congress, and in a couple of months, a committee was appointed to draw up a formal statement. Thomas Jefferson was selected by the committee to make the draft. 6 months, almost to the day, after Paine's Common Sense appeared, Congress issued that famous document, which we call the Declaration of Independence. It has often been claimed that Paine actually composed and wrote the Declaration. This is debatable, and there seems to be no strong evidence to that effect, but that he was the man, more so than any other, who caused it to be written, no one can deny. All of the leaders of the Revolution gave him full credit for solidifying the sentiment for independence. Washington, converted by Common Sense, wrote asserting that Paine's words were, quote, sound doctrine and unanswerable reasoning. Jefferson, John Adams, Franklin, and Madison all wrote praising Paine's flaming arguments. In later years, Thomas Jefferson said of Paine, quote, no writer has exceeded Paine in ease and familiarity of style, perspicuity of expression, happiness of elucidation, and in simple and unassuming language, end quote. Franklin said, I value myself on the share I had in procuring for America the acquisition of so useful and valuable a citizen as Thomas Paine. John Adams wrote, history will ascribe the Revolution to Thomas Paine.
Our Constitution, The Way It Was by Dr. Madeleine O'Hare is now available at atheistaudiobooks.com.
What if you're wrong?
Well, what if I'm wrong? I mean, anybody could be wrong. We could all be wrong about the flying spaghetti monster and the pink unicorn and the flying teapot. You happen to have been brought up, I would presume, in the Christian faith. You know what it's like not to believe in a particular faith because you're not a Muslim, you're not a Hindu. Why aren't you a Hindu? Because you happen to have been brought up in America, not in India. If you've been brought up in India, you'd be a Hindu. If you were brought up in Denmark in the time of the Vikings, you'd be believing in Wotan and Thor. If you were brought up in classical Greece, you'd be believing in Zeus. If you were brought up in Central Africa, you'd be believing in the great Juju up the mountain. I mean, there's no particular reason to pick on the Judeo-Christian God in which, by the sheerest accident, you happen to have been brought up, and ask me the question, what if I'm wrong? What if you're wrong about the great Juju at the bottom of the sea?
You're listening to The Phil Ferguson Show.
All right, everybody, welcome back. This is, of course, Phil Ferguson, and you are still listening to The Phil Ferguson Show. With me today, I have Ray Smock, and I'm going to give you a little bit of his background here, and while he listens quietly. He is currently the director of the Robert C. Byrd Center for Congressional Studies and History. and I may have that not technically correct, he can fix me, was the co-editor, one of the co-editors of a 14-volume series documentary of books and papers on Booker T. Washington. So I'm sure we can talk about that. And he's written many other things about the United States and United States history, and even served in Congress. And now I lost my notes, so jump in here and tell me, what was your job at Congress, Ray?
Well, I was the historian of the House of Representatives for 12 years, and I was the first one, and that was back in the 1980s, early 90s, when they wanted someone to plan for the 200th anniversary of Congress and the Constitution. So I was the guy that got the job, and we had a great time there. Loved that job and loved being able to get to see Congress from the inside.
And so you're the historian. What does that mean? What did you actually do as the historian?
Well, since I was the first, and they didn't know exactly what they wanted.
Isn't that best?
They knew they wanted someone to plan for the 200th anniversary, which meant that I was going to be talking about the historical aspects, going back 200 years, looking at the early Congresses, doing publications about Congress. One of the things that Congress does is publish a biographical directory of everybody that's ever served in the House and Senate. They started publishing that in 1859, and it went back all the way to the first Congress. So there's more than 12,000 biographies.
Wow!
And that hadn't been updated in a long time, and it had never been done by professional historians before. So one of my first assignments was to do the first edition of that would eventually be turned into a digital edition. This is, again, 1980s, where you're not on the internet yet, but digital publishing is coming along in a big way. So, and my argument was, once we get this done digitally, it'll be ready forever, and you could update it much easier. They were publishing it in a huge, thick book of more than several thousand pages. So it was that kind of work. We did research on every member of Congress. We updated the biographical directory. We worked with the Senate Historical Office on that. We did publications related to all the women that served in Congress, the African Americans in Congress, books about the origins of the House of Representatives under the Constitution, going back to the early debates. So that was the kind of thing that I was doing. I wasn't the kind of guy that was sitting there watching what went on every day in the House of Representatives. You've got all kinds of clerks and recorders for that. It all goes in the congressional record. What they never had was someone that was going to go back and look at the full 200-year history and decide what needed to be done to make it better, more accessible.
Now, is that it's the biographical directory? That's what we're talking about?
Yeah.
Is that online now?
It's online, yeah. You can just search biographical directory of the U.S. Congress, and you'll find it.
Excellent. So this is one of those shows that the people who study or love history, like you do, are going to like, and so that would be a great resource. And I'm seeing here that there's also one specifically for, it says blacks, for African Americans in Congress and women in Congress.
Right.
And so were they part of that, or was that a supplemental thing that was done later?
Those were done later, and we did the first editions of those, and then the people who have succeeded me over the last 20 years in that job, they've upgraded and updated those publications, and of course there's a lot more women serving in Congress, even from the time that we did our history back in the 1990s. So it's Congress seems like a very static place, and we keep talking about term limits because we got to get these characters out of there if you don't like them. What I see when I look at the full 200 years, I see a very fluid, a very dynamic House and Senate with people coming and going, and a huge turnover when you get right down to it. There's always a few senior people who've been there for seems like forever, but even those folks, they're not there forever either.
Yeah,
they might be there for 30 or 40 years, but that's not all that long.
It's something that I can kind of relate to in investing, is that we can get so focused on something not going the way we want for this month or this week or this year that we forget about the big picture. And that, as a historian, that's often your job, isn't it, to kind of look at the big picture and you get to study it.
To try to put it into some kind of a context that goes beyond what you hear every day on the news, what you get in the sort of the instant 24-hour news cycle. There's no context to that, and so and of course when I was there at the house, the number one question that the press was always asking us when something would happen: has this ever happened before? And they would think that this is brand new; it's never happened before, and we would find other examples in history and put it in perspective. When I look back, that would be the number one question that reporters ask me. Has this ever happened before?
Well, getting ready for this, and the listeners can do the same thing if they're fans of history, there's some videos on YouTube where you talk or give talks or you're interviewed. And one of those I happened to listen to, you said something that really hit a sweet spot for me, because when I was in junior high and high school, I don't think I took any history in college whatsoever because I was already ruined by that point. I was trained to not be interested in it because I grew up in a system of memorizing dates and facts and names, and it was painfully dry and boring. And when my son went to his high school, they would take a couple of weeks to study a specific subject, and the professor would distribute copies of original documents. And you mentioned in one of your talks that you had a professor that did something like that, where I think you called it history via documents. Can you talk about that a little bit and the philosophy of that?
That is the way that you really learn. I don't use, and I never did like when I teach classes. I don't like to use textbooks. I like to use documents, and that's how history came alive to me when I was an undergrad. Actually, I was in a junior college in the Midwest in Illinois, and I had a professor that would bring in documents. He taught American history, he taught British history. Small school, you got these guys that teach all kinds of subjects, but he brought the documents in, and we would read and try to understand the documents. And that led me to actually a career as a documentary editor. Yesterday was my last day, early December, first day of December. I don't know when this is going to be broadcast, but I've been a commissioner for the National Historic Publications and Records Commission, which is part of the National Archives in D.C. I was at my last meeting yesterday, and looking back on a long career of supporting and working on documentary editions. You mentioned that I worked on Booker T. Washington. That's the one project I worked on.
Right.
But I've trained a lot of editors, and these are the people who do the multi-volume studies of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, the Founding Fathers, more contemporary figures, and Martin Luther King papers, for example. I've consulted on that collection. There's all these basic documents that form the core of our history, and when you get in there and read them, the thing that if you like being a historian, you like to read other people's mail, and you really get into the story by listening to what they're saying. Well, I'll give you an example. Unless you have a question first before I go any further.
No, give me the example, please.
I'll give you an example of something we're working on right now here at the Byrd Center. There's about 10,000 petitions that the first people that in the first Congress, 1789, go back to the very first Congress. The United States has never had a Congress before. People all over the country are saying, what is this new entity? How can it help me? And they started writing these petitions, these letters, appealing to Congress to help them with something. They had very specific issues. One of them, for example, was a petition from the whalers of Nantucket. And they said that they wanted the government to help them dredge their harbor because they couldn't afford to do it themselves. And the reason they needed their harbor dredged was so that they could get their big whaling boats out even at high tide. They couldn't get over the bar anymore. And they needed to get the whaling boats out because these ships were great big ships that had to go halfway around the world to catch whales. And they tell in their petition how in the early days they went out in small boats because the whales were right there. But the whales, having left our shore, they said, well, they left the shore because they fished them out.
Right.
And so the whaling industry was a global industry from the very beginning in the early history of the country. And these guys going out on these long voyages in these big ships and going all the way into the Pacific. And this one petition tells the whole story and gives a capsule history of the whaling industry in a way that you can really understand it. Anybody could pick up this document and read that story and understand exactly what was going on. And that's the kind of history that it really comes alive for you. And I love that sort of thing.
Well, I do too, and I really regret that in high school I was just memorizing facts because I wasn't interested. And it was kind of a combination of reading these things that my son would bring home and the nuance that, I don't know, because I almost felt like they were cardboard cutouts and you were just memorizing things. But when you read, especially if you read different authors' takes on a person like George Washington, different contemporaneous authors and different people 200 years ago had different perspectives on him because he was a real human being and sometimes might change his mind or put a different spin on it depending on who he's talking to. So it becomes very subtle and nuanced, and it's a much more rich experience.
That's exactly right. You see people in three dimensions, not as somebody who just did something in a textbook and they describe what they did, and you really don't understand exactly why it was so important that what they did at that particular time. I think a lot of history is taught almost by rote, by textbook. You're supposed to memorize things. You have to have a reason to get excited about it. You know, there's some people who say they don't really like history are really pretty good historians. It's just they're historians of different things. For example, in sports, I'm sure you know people, I know people like this, in their particular sport, whether it's football, baseball, soccer, whatever, you name it, they can tell you statistics, they can tell you who won the World Series in 1912, they can tell you who pitched the no-hitter in 1947, because to them, this is part of the lure of the sport that they love. And so they get all that stuff, and they don't think that they had to really memorize anything. They just learned it because it was important for them to know. And then they provide a context, because then they'll get in arguments with one another. They'll say, well, who was the greatest pitcher that the Cleveland Indians ever had? Well, then they start arguing about that because they know the stats. Well, that's really what historians do. You know, you have to know the background, you have to know the context, and then you can start judging and putting nuance on it, bringing the spirit of these various players into the story. That's always been fascinating to me. I'm getting to be an pretty old timer. I've been doing this for a long time. I still get excited when I read something new, when I read a new document, when I see some new history. And history is being made every day, so it never goes out of style. And I am absolutely thrilled by it, never got tired of it.
Now, I happen to know that in Philadelphia, you were involved with a little building there that my wife and I toured a couple years ago. What's that thing called?
Boy, it happens to be the National Constitution Center, which is the only national museum dedicated to the U.S. Constitution. I was the chief historical consultant on the exhibits there when it was built. It opened in 2003, and one of the things that I researched was exactly what all the founding fathers looked like, what they wore, how their hair was
and
done.
There is a room where many of the founding fathers, if not all of them, are arranged as kind of as if they're in a cocktail party, and you can walk around and see them in their actual height and clothes, and one of them looked a lot like you.
Only the body. While I was working on all the statues and doing all the research, and then there was a studio, wonderful studio in New York City that had fine sculptures and artists, And they were making life-size bronze statues of the 42 people who were in the room at the moment that the last signer signed the Constitution on September 17th, 1787. So that's what the scene is. And at that particular moment, all of them were in their places. When I was doing the research on what they looked like, what size they were, they didn't have driver's licenses that told you their height, width, the color of their eyes, and everything like that. A lot of that you had to dig out of diaries and secondary sources. But in the case of Ben Franklin, a suit of his clothes exists at the Smithsonian in D.C. So I went to the Smithsonian. They brought out this rare suit, and I had to put on the rubber gloves to hold on to it, and measured it. Turned out I was exactly the same size as Benjamin Franklin. And so I became the body double for the statue of Benjamin Franklin that's there at the center.
You can put that on your resume.
Which was a great thrill for me just to see how the whole process went, because you really used live people. You cast them in it's like you're a full body plaster cast, and then from that they create these forms, and then they create the bronze statues from that. So I got to go through the whole process of becoming the body of Ben Franklin, and so I'm not Ben Franklin. I don't have his brain. I don't have his status in American history, but our bodies are the same.
There you
so
go.
that was a bonus.
I remember
in the work I did on that whole wonderful museum.
Yeah, that's a heck of a room. With all the people there, and they're arranged and conversation, and some are signing, some are debating, some are talking, some are sitting. But what else is in that museum?
Well, in that particular museum, there's a huge exhibit hall that tells you the full story of the major elements of the Constitution. So it's a big circular hall, and you can go through and see, and it's, some of it's interactive. You can stand up as if you're being inaugurated president. You can they'll do a little video for you while you're there. There's this big tree of names that's a big circular event. All people who've had things to do with the Constitution, and you can come up and you can say, well, what does this person have to do with the Constitution? You push a button, and it will tell you the story. And one of the images up there on this big Constitution exhibit, the family tree of constitutionalism, is Mickey Mouse. And of course, that's the one that gets the kids all the time.
Yeah.
What in blazes is Mickey Mouse's picture doing in here with all these founding fathers, with all these other cases and legal precedents regarding the Constitution? Well, it has to do with copyright.
I was going to guess.
And Mickey Mouse was a copyrighted cartoon, and when the copyright was about to run out, Walt Disney worked very hard to get that extended for Mickey Mouse. So it became a major constitutional suit regarding copyright law. So that's why Mickey Mouse is there. Even Mickey Mouse can tell you a story about the U.S. Constitution.
Well, and I did hear one of the talks that you gave, again, I found on YouTube, that was a little old. You were talking about a brand new thing called, what was this, an app that you could put on your phone about the Constitution. How's that today?
Yeah, well, you can do that now. I always carry a pocket Constitution with me because I'm constantly referring to it, but I really don't need to, because I also have an app on my cell phone that has not only the Constitution but the entire Federalist Papers, which was those original wonderful essays that were written by James Madison and Alexander Hamilton for the most part. And all these things I carry around. They're on your phone, and you can get an app. Some of them are free. There's wonderful apps that the National Constitution Center has, and also the National Archives, where the original Constitution is. Yeah, this stuff is not remote anymore. It can be pretty handy.
Well, I think one of these, you told a story about, I guess it was Nixon's men wanted to see the original Declaration of Independence. What was that all about?
Well, when that really just shows you the power of the Constitution. When Nixon was about to be impeached, and he knew it was getting close. The Judiciary Committee of the House was about ready to vote, and he was being advised that he ought to do something. Nixon's lawyers, he sent a team of lawyers to the National Archives because they wanted to look at the original 4 pages of manuscript, which is kept in a great big vault underground most of the time. It's in a bomb-proof vault. So the Archivist of the United States arranged for Nixon's lawyers to see the original pages. They spread them out for him. It's very careful. Those are very fragile, and they're not usually viewed. They're viewed under glass, under special helium glass, rare gases to keep it from deteriorating anymore. But they let Nixon's lawyers look at it, and they were looking for some comma, some interpretation, something that might give them a little handle, that give them an edge. And I thought that was really amazing that they would go to that length just before Nixon resigned to make a last check with the original document, that they were actually going to touch base.
Wow.
And of course, that was a very tense time. A lot of people have forgotten how tense that was and what a constitutional crisis it was at the time. And later I had conversations with Chief Justice Warren Burger about those times. And I used to have lunch with him occasionally at the court because we worked with the court on some of these bicentennial issues related to the Constitution. And he said that the thing that impressed him most about the whole Watergate thing and the Nixon's eventual resignation was that the Constitution held and that the Constitution worked the way it was supposed to, and that the members of the House were playing out their roles of going through the impeachment process in the proper form as outlined in the Constitution. And he said we didn't know at the time how well it was going to work, but the Constitution prevailed, and that was the great relief that he said he felt at the time.
Well, that is neat. Now, have you ever seen it in person?
Oh, yes, I have, of course, yeah.
Can the average person do that, or is that's going to be kind of tricky?
Well, anybody can come and see the Constitution that's on display. It's at the National Archives in the Great Hall. But what you don't always know is that you're only seeing 1 or 2 pages. And because it's so fragile, the average person doesn't know it, but they're looking at a copy. And because it is very fragile. And they rotate that because even in the dim light, you go in there, it's very dim light. They're trying to protect this document. In the old days, the original copy of the Constitution was just kept in a storage box over at the State Department and in a file box, and they would trot it out every once in a while, like on the 4th of July, and they would put it out in sunlight, just display it.
Right.
Nobody had any sense of preserving this document as a relic and as a real fundamental document, and it was practically faded away. The Declaration of Independence is the same way. It's very difficult to read. It's faded badly because it was neglected. No one realized the power of sunlight. They should have. I mean, you can send a newspaper out for a couple of days in the sunlight, and it turns yellow. Well, this was much better paper. It was parchment, and it wouldn't turn yellow that fast. But the ink is what fades, and so we've learned a lot how to preserve these great documents, and so the archives takes great care of them, and that's why when you walk into that space in the rotunda of the archives, it's so dark in there. It's dim, it's lit. You can see what you're doing, but that's to protect those rare documents. Now,
it's interesting. I mean, these documents are 200 plus years old. What about the original books of the Bible that are almost 2,000 years old? How do you think they're holding up?
Well, they keep finding these Dead Sea Scrolls and other things like that, where some of these early documents, some of them biblical, some of them not, that have been miraculously preserved by being in a very dry atmosphere and out of sunlight in the desert conditions. And so some of these have been remarkably preserved, but even a lot of those are not all that well done. And of course, some of those are not even chapters in the Bible. They're not accepted as chapters in the Bible,
Right.
but they were probably biblical texts.
Now, I know my listeners might want to know that you have books that you've written, and I'm looking at Amazon, and there's a lot of them for sale, but some of them, dude, kind of pricey.
Oh, yeah. Well, the kind of work that I do, I did a biography of Booker T. Washington a few years ago, which is well received, and it's a nice read, and it's in a it was done by a trade publisher, and you can find that, and it's a good summation of all the work I did for many years on the documents. No one's going to pick up 14 volumes of Booker T. Washington papers and read them. But I did.
Yeah, I was gonna say,
there
how
was more
long
than
did
a million items in his collection. It took us 9 years to read the material, and then we sorted it down to 175,000 documents for research purposes, and then we published only 6,000 of what we considered the best, and that took up 14 volumes. So that's the kind of documentary editing when you deal with those big collections. But in other things that I've done. We did a 2-volume history of congressional investigations.
Right.
That's an expensive volume. It was done as a reference book, but it's in libraries. It's available as a digital book as well. It's not for downloadable. You have to buy it, but
Right.
it's available as a digital book as well. But those are reference tools. Most of my work has been providing sort of encyclopedic works, biographical directories. The study that we did of congressional investigations going back to the very first one in 1792 and taking it all the way up to Hurricane Katrina, we drew on top experts when we're talking about investigations of the CIA. That was written by a retired CIA agent, and basically I served as the overall editor. So we got experts to do those. I wrote the one on Watergate because that's something that I have researched and worked on, and we had top people do all kinds of good work. And again, that's for reference purposes. It's used a lot. You see those volumes on Capitol Hill. You see them. Some journalists refer to them. Journalists don't read books much anymore. They just get on the phone or get on the internet.
Right.
So they call me a lot about when they want to know about some congressional investigation and whether it's ever been done before like this.
Well, I do want to circle back to the one affordable book, at least for most listeners, is your Booker T. Washington, Black Leadership in the Age of Jim Crow. It's here on Amazon for $12. Almost any bookstore will have it for $15 or $16. How did you get the thousands and thousands of documents that you whittled down to 14 great big books into one little book?
Well, it's a different kind of a writing. What I wrote was what I would call it an interpretive biography, taking the main elements of Washington's career, relying heavily on the research that I did many years ago. And there's other books written about Booker T. Washington, and they all rely on the papers that we edited at the University of Maryland many years ago. And very few people go back to the Library of Congress and look at those original million items. They're still there.
Right.
And those are well preserved. But for most practical purposes, this edition serves the purpose. But I was looking to tell a story there.
Right.
When you're doing a documentary history, you're letting the documents unfold, and you're trying to provide a context for them. But when you write a biography, an interpretive biography, then you have to decide of all the things that this man did in his life and all the things that impacted him and he impacted, what are the key stories, and how do you weave that into a narrative? So that was the joy of doing that, reflecting on his entire career and reflecting on all the research that I had done earlier, and writing it in chapter form so that you could follow it and read it and enjoy it.
Well, and you segued right into my next idea in reference to Booker T. Washington. Give me a story that is, a watershed moment in his career, something that changed the outcome of American history.
Well, of course, Booker T. Washington was a black leader back in the Jim Crow era. He was a friend of Theodore Roosevelt when he was president, and so he started out in humbly as a slave himself, and then built Tuskegee Institute in Alabama as a premier school for the newly freed slaves back in the 1880s and 90s, and the second generation of free blacks. But he had to walk the color line. In other words, people have no idea, most people have no idea how bad the racism was and the lynchings that went on. And there was this artificial boundary that you did not cross if you were, it was a segregated society. Now, he was a world leader who could be with presidents and kings. He would visit the Queen of England when he went to Europe. He was an exception in a lot of ways. But when he went and actually had dinner at the White House in 1901 with Theodore Roosevelt, and Roosevelt didn't think anything of inviting him to come to the White House to have dinner, that caused a national scandal, especially in the South. He had crossed the color line. Both the President Roosevelt and Booker T. Washington were highly criticized, and he had death threats and everything else for having the audacity to sit down and eat with not just any white man, but the President of the United States. So that's the kind of thing he had to overcome. So he had to play he developed an elaborate secret life. And that's the book tells a part of that secret life. I'll give you one little story if you want one little example of how the secret life worked. There was in the town of Tuskegee, which is in Alabama, down in the heart of segregated South, and this is in the 1890s. There was a black lawyer that lived in the town. Nobody particularly liked him, but he among the whites they didn't like him. But he had a habit of socializing across racial lines. So the townspeople decided to drive him out of town. They sent him a note and saying, if you're not out of town by sunset, we're coming after you. They were going to lynch him. And so he didn't get the message until the sun had already gone down. And so the mob was coming down the street at him. He was trying to flee. They saw he was going to get away, and so they shot him in the leg. And his son carted him off, and late that night took him to Booker T. Washington's front door, and said, "You got to help us. You got to help us." And so shortly thereafter, the mob, still looking for him, came to Booker T. Washington's door. And when it was a huge mob, they had their weapons, and most of them were drunk by then. And they came to Washington's door, and they said, "Where is this man at? And did he come here? We heard he came to the school." And Booker said, "Yes, he came here, and I turned him away. I want nothing to do with this." And so the mob went away, and the local newspapers the next day praised him for not getting involved. In the meantime, in the North, the black followers of Booker T. Washington were incensed. They said, "How could you turn away a man in that circumstance?" Well, here's what he did. He got his own wagon and spirited the guy off to Montgomery, which is about 40 miles away, Montgomery, Alabama, and there he had Booker T's personal physician fix his leg and paid for it himself, and he did that all on the quiet. That's the kind of story that comes out of the South in those days. So he didn't lie to the mob, but he didn't tell them the whole truth either.
Yeah, and you also talked about one of the things I saw. At some point, he made kind of an offer, a negotiation, a deal about getting education in exchange for socially accepted status. Can you tell us a little bit about that? You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, well, that's his most famous speech. If you had to read one speech that Booker T. Washington wrote, it would be the one he gave at the Atlanta International Exposition in 1895. And it was called, later became called the Atlanta Compromise. He basically said that he accepted segregation. He wanted African Americans in the South to have a chance to get a job and to educate themselves, because ultimately those would be the ways that you would be able to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. And that he would not, he would cease, he would tell his people not to agitate for their civil rights. And so it's a compromise. Leave us alone. Let us be. Quit lynching us. Quit attacking us. And we will agree not to agitate for our civil rights if you will allow us to get a decent education and to have jobs and to hold them. And at the time, that was considered a marvelous solution to the race problem in the country. Even some of the more radical African Americans at the time, W.B. Du Bois, was the leading black intellectual of the same period. He thought it was a great idea, and it was an idea whose time had come. But, of course, that eventually fell apart, and as the civil rights movement, as the modern civil rights movement started to grow in the 1950s and into the 60s and beyond, then Booker T. Washington, his compromise looked like capitulation, like surrender.
Right.
And so he fell out of popularity as a black leader. Of course, he's long dead by then. He died in 1915. But he was still, considered one of the great leaders. But he started to fall out of favor. And part of our work, in a way, in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, during the civil rights movement, I was studying the most unpopular African American leader in the country, which was Booker T. Washington, and we were discovering new things about him and how he had this elaborate secret life. He never gave up on fighting for civil rights. He got a lot of money from Andrew Carnegie, the wealthiest man in America at the time. Carnegie liked what Booker T. Washington was doing. He gave him a large amount of money, which Washington used in all kinds of ways to secretly finance civil rights cases and to work with the President of the United States, with Theodore Roosevelt and his Justice Department. All of that done secretly, so that he could keep up the appearance that he was still living up to the Atlanta Address from 1895, and he was not agitating for civil rights. But privately he was. And that's what a lot of the people that were in the civil rights movement in the 60s didn't understand either, that no one had ever looked at those papers before, and they didn't know about his secret life.
Oh, that's just absolutely amazing. And it makes me think of today. Booker T. Washington understood the value of education and how education is the way forward. What do you think about some calls today to dismantle the American education system?
I find it outrageous. I have a chapter in my book called The Power of Education. Education has always been the key to freedom. It's the key to being a master of your own fate. It gives you the power not to be hoodwinked, and on every level, education is the thing that is vital. And I don't care whether it's education for trades, education for college entrance, and abstract thinking and science. It's all part of a fabric to me. That if you're not educated in some way, and I prefer a general education. I think everybody should have and some of the schools are getting back to that. And some leading educators are now saying, we've divided up education into too many little segments. Your science here and your humanities here, and you have all your professional schools, your nursing schools. You got all of these different specialties. That everybody ought to have a little bit of science and a little bit of humanities as the basis for whatever else they want to do with their entire life. And I think that's even more important nowadays because people aren't trained to just do one thing the rest of their life. Some youngster coming up today is going to probably have to reinvent him or herself a half a dozen times because the technology will change, the needs of society will change so fast, much faster. That's one of the reasons in this last election we saw the last vote of the muscle generation, the people who actually worked with their hands, the people who've been completely bypassed with the decline of industrial employment in this country.
Right.
And we haven't retrained those people fast enough. And even when that doesn't work either.
Yeah, I was talking to a friend recently about one of the things Trump said about, bringing back coal jobs. It's just not going to happen. I mean, we are using more coal today than ever, but we have ginormous machines that take off the entire top of a mountain. We're not sending hundreds of men down into mines.
I'm sitting here in West Virginia, so I'm fully aware of the coal situation. I'm in the other end of the state, but West Virginia is a state where the politics is completely dominated by coal issues and coal jobs. And one of the reasons that this state went entirely for Donald Trump was because of some things that Hillary Clinton said out of context, but didn't make any difference whether it was in context. Once the word gets out that
I
she
know what you're
was
talking
going
about.
to shut down coal mines and put miners out of work, what she was saying was that the nature of the technological world and the need for new energy sources that are not going to contribute to global warming will eventually shut down coal mines and put miners out of work. And then she went on to say, and we've got to help do something about that. But that part was left out.
Yep. Yeah, I know what you're talking about. I had some friends that listened to Fox News, and they would talk about how Hillary wants to shut down the coal mines. And I said,
right,
they're going to shut down. They're a thing of the past. Coal is not yet a thing of the past, but coal mines are. And those jobs are going to go away, and they're never going to come back. And those people need to learn something else. They can understand how solar panels work or climb a tower and help put up wind turbines. There's other things these people can do. They have skills, but someone needs to give them specific instructions and education on how to do it.
Yes, and there's been lots of retraining bills. It's never been adequate enough. But then the thing that you have to deal with in the real economy of a terribly poor state like West Virginia is that there's just nothing left. It's hollowed out. You can say, okay, I'm going to retrain somebody, but what job are they going to have? There's no jobs in their towns anymore, even the new jobs. There's no manufacturing coming into the state except in the northern part where I am, in the what we call the Eastern Panhandle, which is close to Baltimore and Washington. We're part of that growing metropolitan area. But the rest of the state, which is about 350 miles away from where I am, on the other side of the mountains and down in the hills close to Kentucky, those people are hurting badly, and there's nobody that wants to come there. So there's nobody that wants to retrain them to do anything. And there's no industries that want to locate there because most of the people that are there are not trained, and the young people are all on drugs. So this gets much more complicated than simply saying, let's retrain the people. And I think this is a global problem. It's what we're seeing in West Virginia and other places where it depend on fossil fuels extraction. In other parts of the world, the same thing is happening. and it's a huge problem. And I don't know what the solution is.
Right. Well, the one last topic I had notes on to go over, and of course you can bring up anything else that you feel we haven't covered. In the last, I don't know, couple decades maybe, the political parties seem to be moving farther and farther apart and demonizing the other side. I wonder if you could address that a little bit from a historical perspective.
Yeah, this is something that I spend a lot of time thinking about, and it's something that has happened over a long period of time. Donald Trump's election is really almost the culmination of something that's been going on in this country for almost 50 years. And all these things began simply enough, and there's not any really demon aspect to it, at least early on. When Ronald Reagan was elected, one of his most famous phrases was that government is not the solution, government is the problem. And so this sort of anti-government attitude that started to develop in the Reagan years really just continued to grow. It never stopped. That somehow the people who lived inside the Beltway in Washington were from another planet, and the rest of the country they didn't understand the rest of the country, and so that it began with that kind of thing. The rise of right-wing radio. Rush Limbaugh has now been on the air, for 30 years?
Right.
And millions of people listen to him every afternoon, wherever they are, driving trucks, doing their jobs, housewives at home, wherever they're listening to Rush on the radio, they find him entertaining. But they also, when you listen to that kind of stuff long enough, you're just whipped into a frenzy of misinformation that he calls entertainment. I mean, and he's not the only one. I don't want to pick on Rush because there's plenty of others. Levin in New York City, and Glenn Beck was part of that crowd for a long time. He seems to be going through some transition. I'm not sure exactly what it is right now.
I understand that, yeah.
So you got that sort of thing. You got the rise of the internet, where everybody can go off and find comfort with little groups of people, and they can become self-fulfilling prophecies. They feed off of one another, and it's almost like a frenzy. And they're the websites of both the left and the right. People don't talk to each other. They talk to one another, and you go on Facebook and you got people who say, well, I can't friend that person because we can't talk, or they unfriend one another. A lot of people got unfriended because of this election, because it brought out so much passion. So there's just a million things like that are going on, plus the decline of journalism, of in-depth reporting journalism, which makes the kind of lies that pass as political dialogue. No one's there to check them. You have fact checkers. You have places on the internet like Snopes and other sites, and then you got the people who are the anti-Snopes people who believe that Snopes is really funded by left-wing billionaires, and so you got the conspiracy theories that are out there. This is an unhealthy political climate. I happen to be a person who believes in government. I'm like the founding fathers. Government is a positive good, and we have lost our ability to see government as a positive good. It's the enemy. Trump was going to drain the swamp. Well, he hasn't drained the swamp. He's replacing the various alligators in the swamp with his own alligators.
Right.
And that's part of what happens after every election. But he was railing against Wall Street, and now everybody he's got in his cabinet is from Goldman Sachs. So far, we don't know how this is going to play out.
Do you think any Trump supporters that like the idea that he might go in and change everything at some point become disillusioned that he didn't do any of it?
I think it's too soon to tell. My personal view is that while I was personally shocked to see a guy like Trump, who ran a campaign of demagoguery and insults and braggadocio, and now he's going around having rallies, which is the work of a dictator and a demagogue who does that sort of thing, rather than acting presidential. He's not acted presidential yet, and I don't think he will. And so we're in for a new kind of president. Whether our systems can tolerate and save him from his worst excesses, this is going to be a big challenge to our constitutional system. I still have confidence in government. I'm going to support Donald Trump as my president whenever I can. Whenever I can hold up his hands when he does something right, I will do it. But I'm basically a watchful critic, and that's going to be my main personal role, is to keep an eye on him. And we should keep an eye on every president and every political party.
Right.
So I'm not suggesting that what I'm doing is radical or far-fetched at all. But this bears close watching. I do think, and we need to sound alarms whenever he's not following the rule of law and not following the Constitution. The rest of it, the politics of Obamacare and how they might modify that, the politics of tax cuts and which I might not like what he's planning to do. Those are all within the realm of what governments do and what new elected people do. They might be mistakes. We don't know that yet. I'm not going to get too worked up about them until I begin to see consequences. But I certainly don't like his style, and I don't like the fact that he's not yet decided to be president of all the people. He's still president of his base. He's still campaigning. He won the election. He should stop campaigning.
Yeah, I think he ended up becoming quite good at that, and I don't think he knows how to stop.
And that bothers me, because if he's going to be the leader of the United States, he's got to have his own space and his own sense of who he is pretty well intact, or he won't be a leader. So it's going to be a tricky, interesting time. Most of my friends in the Democratic Party are absolutely bonkers right now. They're in grief. They're mourning. I've never seen anything quite like it in terms of the extent of it.
Well, I do know that probably the vast majority of my listeners are going to be in that same situation. I do have some listeners and friends on Facebook that like Trump, but the vast majority are probably Democratic. They're probably quite liberal, and the biggest thing I've had to do in the last few weeks is try to get people to take some deep breaths and not panic. And then if you don't like the way the system is working, try to figure out what you can do to change it, especially in 2 years.
Phil, I think you said the right thing exactly. Take a deep breath. I got people that are calling me almost every day. Well, what can we do to change the Electoral College, or can't we get some of these electors, which are going to meet this next week here, and then they're going to meet later on to actually cast their ballots later in December. I used to go to those sessions and watch them count the electoral ballots. I'd be on the floor when the electoral ballots were counted. Nobody shows up. This year they will, I'm sure. Yeah. It'll be a big media circus probably. But it's a very quiet kind of a thing. There's some members there. The Secretary of the Senate, the Clerk of the House act as functionaries. The Vice President, actually Joe Biden, will be the one who represents the Senate, and because he's President of the Senate, they will count these ballots and go through the formal process. People say, why can't we stop that? Why can't we get these people to vote differently? That's this pie in the sky.
Yeah,
none of that's going to work.
It's not.
The Constitution is very clear on this, and I'm a constitutionalist. Both parties played by the same rules. The election turned out to be a surprise, but it was a constitutional election, and the election is decided by the Electoral College, whether we like it or not.
Well, Ray, we've covered lots of things. Is there anything that you want to throw in there before we hit the road and go on with our lives?
Well, I just want to thank you, Phil, for the opportunity to be on your show and to chat with you. And anytime that you think I can be of any service to you or any discussion that you want to have, I'd be happy to join you anytime. And if any of your listeners think that I had anything to say that was interesting to them and they want to have me come back, the pay is right, 0, so I'll come on anytime.
Excellent. Well, again, the listeners, if you want to get something really wonderful to read, his book on Booker T. Washington is available in all bookstores at a very reasonable price, and it's probably some history that you haven't properly learned about, so go check that out. And Ray Smock, everybody, thank you so much for being on the Phil Ferguson Show. I greatly appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Phil.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye.
This is Phil Ferguson with Polaris Financial Planning, the home of science-based investing. I see people owning really bad investments all of the time. Many advisors are paid a commission by a big company to sell you something you may not need. It's kind of like church. They create fear, then they tell you what you want to hear, and then they take your money. What you want is an advisor that is paid only by you. That is a fee-only fiduciary advisor. Remember, people work for who they are paid by. You can contact me, Phil, at PolarisFinancialPlanning.com, or listen to the cleverly titled The Phil Ferguson Show. Each show, we have an interesting investing skeptically topic and an interview with someone fighting to end religion. Polaris also gives 10% of gross revenue to support the growing secular movement. You're not just getting better investments, you're helping to change the world.
Here's an excerpt from Fear of Physics by Lawrence Krauss.
A physicist, an engineer, and a psychologist are called in as consultants to a dairy farm whose production has been below par. Each is given time to inspect the details of the operation before making a report. The first to be called is the engineer, who states,
"The size of the stalls for the cattle should be decreased. Efficiency could be improved if the cows were more closely packed, with a net allotment of 275 cubic feet per cow. Also, the diameter of the milking tubes should be increased by 4% to allow for a greater average flow rate during the milking periods."
The next report is the psychologist, who proposes the inside of the barn should be painted green. This is a more mellow color than brown and should help induce greater milk flow. Also, more trees should be planted in the fields to add diversity to the scenery for the cattle during grazing to reduce boredom. Finally, the physicist is called upon. He asks for a blackboard and then draws a circle. He begins.
"Assume the cow is a sphere."
This old joke, if not very funny, does illustrate how, at least metaphorically, physicists picture the world. The set of tools physicists have to describe nature is limited. Most of the modern theories you read about began life as simple models by physicists who didn't know how else to start to solve a problem. These simple little models are usually based on simpler little models, and so on, because the class of things that we do know how to solve exactly can be counted on the fingers of one, maybe two hands. For the most part, physicists follow the same guidelines that have helped keep Hollywood movie producers rich. If it works, exploit it. If it still works, copy it. I like the cow joke because it provides an allegory for thinking simply about the world, and it allows me to jump right into an idea that doesn't get written about too much, but that is essential for the everyday workings of science. Before doing anything else, abstract out all irrelevant details. There are two operatives here, abstract and irrelevant. Getting rid of irrelevant details is the first step in building any model of the world, and we do it subconsciously from the moment we are born. Doing it consciously is another matter. Overcoming the natural desire not to throw out unnecessary information is probably the hardest and most important part of learning physics. In addition, what may be irrelevant in a given situation is not universal, but depends in most cases on what interests you. This leads us to the second operative word, abstraction. Of all the abstract thinking required in physics, probably the most challenging, lies in choosing how to approach a problem. The mere description of movement along a straight line, the first major development in modern physics, required enough abstraction that it largely eluded some pretty impressive intellects until Galileo.
Fear of Physics by Lawrence Krauss. Find this audiobook and many more at atheistaudiobooks.com. The facts you won't hear in church. You're listening to The Phil Ferguson Show on Secular Media Network.
A lot of people come up here and they thank Jesus for this award. I want you to know that no one had less to do with this award than Jesus. He didn't help me a bit. If it was up to him, Caesar Milan would be up here with that damn dog. So all I can say is, suck it, Jesus. This award is my God now.
You're listening to The Phil Ferguson Show.
Well, I do hope that you enjoyed the interview with Ray Smock. We had a great time chatting. The funny thing is, as soon as I stopped recording, we talked for another half hour. So we will have to have Ray back. We are kind of kindred spirits, and I think we've got a lot to learn from him in history. And like we talked a little bit about the interview, I didn't really study history. I didn't like it. And maybe for some listeners, I know we had one complaint that maybe I was injecting too much of myself, but I guess that's kind of my style. But I will have to admit, and this is one of the parts of the show where sometimes I will read customer reviews. Erica Abbott, who had previously given me 3 stars on iTunes, changed it to 4. And I think that it may be because I was willing to acknowledge that I do sometimes get negative reviews and negative ratings. But Erica added this: I'm editing this to 4 stars because 3 stars may seem as bad as 1 star. Not really, but I appreciate the sentiment. I really do. I'll still recommend more segments aimed at lower-income individuals to broaden audience base and give more people information on where to start. All right, fair enough, Erica. Yeah, and hopefully this show, at least at the beginning when we talked about stocks and the stock market and how to invest, that can help somebody. But to address this specific issue, if you have only $1,000 to invest, you should go and open up an account at Vanguard.com, and buy one of their target date funds. Now, I have had shows on target date funds before and some of the issues that I have with them. And this is actually, now that I mention it, one of those areas that often when I talk about the stuff on the show, some listeners, and it's a very small percentage, I'm sure, create a dichotomy. So if I suggest that a target date fund is not the best way to invest, they then interpret that as target date funds are bad. It is not that way. There is this giant continuum, and you know, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 is going to be the index funds and how you do them and how you manage them. And there's an infinite number. Well, I guess not really. There's a lot of index funds you can use, and there's different reasons to use different ones at different times. But down on the 1 is a variable annuity or a master limited partnership, things that are just downright awful and you should never invest in. And we've had many shows on them, and we'll have them again in the future. A target date fund is probably something, depending on which target date fund, because some of them are awful and they're going to be around a 3 or 4, but the ones at Vanguard might be a 7 or 8 or even a 9, depending on your situation. And if you only have $1,000 and you can't get into any of the other Vanguard funds that require $3,000, it for you becomes a 10. So if you are young and just starting out, you're in your 20s or 30s, or I hope not in your 40s and starting out, because that's a problem and you better really get at it. But if you only have $1,000, a Vanguard target date fund is fantastic. And you probably want to pick one around the time frame. They usually have a year associated with them, like a target date 2020 or 2035 or 2050. You want to pick one that is close to the year you expect to retire, or 5 to 10 years after that, because Vanguard tends to be a little more conservative with their portfolios than I like to be. But if you're 30, it doesn't really matter if you pick the 2040 or 2045 fund. They're going to have about the same stuff in it because they're thinking you're going to retire in 30 plus years. So most of it is going to be the stock market. Most of it's going to be the U.S. stock market versus international. It's going to be very little bonds, and your returns are going to be pretty good if the market goes up. If the market goes down, you're going to lose a lot of money. But it's a great place to start with just $1,000. Once you get to $3,000, if all you have is $3,000, you can buy the Vanguard Total Stock Market Index. And that way you have everything in the United States. If you get to $10,000, you can buy the Vanguard Total Stock Market Index, what they call Admiral shares. The expense ratio goes down a little bit, and you can switch from the regular shares to the Admiral shares quite easily if you are in an IRA, a Roth IRA, or a 401k, because there's no tax consequences. If you are in a taxable account, the teeny little bit of savings that you might get might not be as valuable as the taxes you might have to pay to move. So think about that. If you need to keep adding to the regular shares of the total stock market, that's fine. And you keep doing that until you get to about $30,000. There's not a whole lot of reason to thrash around. I don't like buying individual stocks. I don't follow them, as we talked about earlier in the show. So there's some ideas, and I'll thank Erica Abbott for bringing that up, of what you can do if you don't have a whole lot of money. So that's, all I have for reviews. If you know of a review that's somewhere else in some other platform where there's podcasts, let me know. Or if you can leave reviews, it really does help me out personally if you do reviews at iTunes or probably in other places, because I think something in their algorithm, the more reviews and more podcasts and the more listens a show has, the more likely it's probably going to get recommended. So that would be very helpful. The other thing, of course, is that you can give donations to your favorite secular charities. I haven't checked the number lately, but last I checked, it was around $1,100, $1,200 was given to American atheists, and you can go to the website atheists.org/Phil, and I said I would match up to $1,500, and it was getting close to $1,200, so I went ahead and made that donation of $1,200 to American atheists. And so because of this show and the listeners, collectively we were able to raise $2,400 so far for American atheists. So thank you all who gave. It's really appreciated, and it's something that's important to me. So people ask all the time, why don't you have a Patreon, etc.? I don't want to. I'm doing okay. This is kind of a weird scenario, unlike a lot of podcasters where they take time away from their job to do their podcast. The podcast is an integral part of my job. And yes, it's shameless, self-promotional, and I'm being an attention whore, and I accept all that. So don't send me money. Go donate to American Atheists, and in the future we may have another organization where we can donate to. And then the last thing I want to talk about for today, it's one of those things where I mentioned earlier, saving 20% is a good idea, but sometimes it's hard to follow one's own advice. And so this last weekend I did something that pretty much didn't follow my advice. I bought a brand new 2017 Prius Prime, and part of the reason was maybe a little bit of jealousy, I guess. Our two older Priuses, this is our fourth Prius, by the way. I had a 5 that I originally bought, and my wife liked it so much we bought her a 6, and this, of course, many years ago. And those cars have now been sold to our son and daughter. So they were able to get a family car that has been well maintained with a great track record, and those cars seem to last forever. So the interior looks like it's got 200,000 miles, but the mechanics of it are still fantastic. And in the spring, we bought a new car for my wife. And when I sold the 2006 Prius to my daughter, I ended up driving my mom's old 2004 Pontiac Vibe. So everyone else was driving a Prius, and I was driving a Pontiac Vibe. It just so turns out that I had a nephew who was in desperate need of a reliable car, and the Vibe was literally the thing that you want to find for a young driver. It's an old car, 2004, with 41,000 miles. So we sold it to my brother-in-law and his son, my nephew. So he now has a fairly reliable car that's been well maintained with only 41,000 miles. And so I kind of found myself without much of a car. We also have a really old minivan, but it gets like 20 miles per gallon, and I didn't want to drive that around, or if I have to go to another conference or something. So I started looking, and something I've always wanted to buy from the very first time I bought a Prius, and I drove somewhere and someone says, "Where do you plug that thing in?" Of course, they were trying to be smartasses about it, but I always wished that I could plug it in. And I know that Teslas and there's other cars like the Nissan Leaf are really cool vehicles, and those are fantastic. I didn't want to spend 50 or 60,000 for a Tesla. Maybe I couldn't have gotten a used one. That would be awesome. But I still have, and I know I've talked to Tesla owners, and several of them listen to the show, so forgive me. I still have a thing called range anxiety. There are occasions where I just have to up and go 300 miles, and at least the current Teslas, unless I'm mistaken, which it happens, you can't quite get that far without having to stop and charge somewhere. And the charge mechanisms are getting better. They're getting faster. And we will all be driving electric-based cars, I think, within my lifetime. But for today, and because I have had such phenomenal success and virtually no repairs, my Prius that I sold to my son now has 220,000 miles. We've still not done brakes because they have magnetic braking, and so you don't have all the friction on the pads and the drums. So they're still original brakes. The only thing I've done with that car is one water pump, of course, belts, hoses, and the real heartbreaker was the headlights. The headlights are designed to never be needing replaced, but they both were. But over 200,000 miles, that's literally all I have fixed is water pump and two headlights. Regular maintenance has been small, and like I said, brakes, still original brakes. It's freaky. So I'm very, very happy. And then they came out with one that you can plug in. It's only 25 miles, but it's 25 miles that I can get while driving on electricity made in the United States of America. And I'm not supporting the oil trade, and I'm not supporting money going to countries that maybe philosophically aren't in favor of our lifestyle. So that's more than enough. I didn't mean this to be the longest show ever, so my apologies. I do thank you for listening, and I do thank you for donating, and I thank you for making all those wonderful 5-star reviews at iTunes and other places. So I'll just wrap up there, and I'll talk to you later. Ciao. Hi. Why are you still here? The show's over. It ended like 15 minutes ago. Get on with your life.